Hello students. Today we're talking about topics worth studying, communities of knowledge, and how to be a responsible member of a community of knowledge. And what I mean by that is the topics that we study in university and the topics that you would work in, the areas of expertise and knowledge that you would work in your future job. These are conversations between knowledgeable people, people who know a lot, people who are experts or experienced. And any of those topics worth studying, are areas where there is deep, varied, and rich conversation. And those conversations have been going on for a long time, some of them for more than 2,000 years. And when I write my essay or make my presentation, in order to join that conversation, in order to stand beside all of the other people who have added their ideas to that conversation in the past, there are some things we need to do. And there are some ways to do it wrong. One way that people do it wrong is to join one of these conversations when they don't really know how the conversation goes yet. They jump in. They're not ready to be part of that conversation, and they look foolish, and people don't listen to them. So, to earn respect, to have our voice listened, to have people listen to our voice, we've got to do something to show that we know how the conversation goes. We know how the conversation has gone before. And one of the ways that we do this is by mentioning the ideas that are well known in that area. The ideas or the thinkers or writers or the concepts. By showing that we have that knowledge, we can earn the respect of the people in that conversation. And this is not just true in academics. This is true in any area where expertise is needed and valued. So one way that we do this is by summarizing and reporting or responding to other people's ideas. This means that we have to learn about the conversation, do some reading, do some research. And as we do that reading and research and then show that we understand the conversation, this is a skill that might be AI proof. There are a lot of jobs that are going to be replaced by AI in the next 20 or 30 years. But one that I don't think will be replaced are areas where we're dealing with humans and areas where we're dealing with ideas and nuance. Okay, and that's what these big conversations are all about. So as we add our voices to these conversations, as we show that we've learned what other people said in these conversations, there's a danger. And the danger is that we can get into a lot of trouble if we are not clear about whose ideas we're talking about. Here are three names of well-known Koreans. Moon Dae-sung, Shin Kyung-suk, and Lee Hyo-ri. These three people are not all equally famous. A few of you might know that Moon Dae-sung is a gold medal winning Taekwondo athlete who was also the president of the Korean International Olympic Committee. Some of you, maybe quite a few of you, will know that Shin Kyung-suk is a writer, one of the first Korean writers to have a translated book appear on the New York Times bestseller list. And probably all of you will know that Lee Hyo-ri is a pop star, a singer. So what's the connection between these three people? All three people have had their careers seriously damaged by a plagiarism scandal. Moon Dae-sung got in a lot of trouble and was kicked out of the International Olympic Committee when it was discovered that he had plagiarized, he had copied his PhD thesis. Shin Kyung-suk was very embarrassed, and her reputation took a lot of damage when they discovered that a few lines from a story that she published were exactly copies of a few sentences from a story years earlier. And Lee Hyori, she had a new album out. She was trying to come back and to reach the top. She wanted to reach that #1 level again. But the new single, the new song that she was out promoting, somebody discovered that it sounded a lot like somebody else's song. And it turns out the songwriter she had hired was stealing other artists' work. So instead of promoting her big album, instead of trying to get to #1, she was apologizing on camera instead of performing on camera. And she was pulling her album off music store shelves and replacing it with a new version that didn't have that song on it, rather than trying to sell as many copies of her album as she could. All three of those people have had their careers hurt by plagiarism. So what is plagiarism? Well, plagiarism is using other people's words or ideas as if they are your own. And it is academic theft. Okay, it's stealing. Plagiarism is a big deal. People have had to quit jobs for it. People have been embarrassed and their careers have been ruined for it. Somehow it seems like every time some politician wants to attack another politician, one of the easy ways to attack them here in Korea is to find some plagiarism in their past. And that connects to the next thing, which is that plagiarism can come back long after you did it. In Shin Kyung-suk's case, she was humiliated in 2015 with the plagiarism scandal. The story that she had written, where the sentences were copied, was published in 1996, almost 20 years earlier. The book that those sentences were taken from were from 1983. So this little bit of copying from a long time in the past came up and threw her career completely off its track. Academic fraud can mark you forever. It sticks on your reputation if you've had a scandal like cheating or plagiarizing. Think of Dr. Hwang Woo-sok, who's done some very interesting work in genetics and cloning, but people will always remember him for the cloning scandal he had. Schools take it very seriously too, because a plagiarism scandal is very embarrassing for any school, any university that is involved in it as well. So a school does not have any reason to be gentle with you if they give you a job and they discover plagiarism in your past, because the school's reputation can also be hurt in a plagiarism scandal. So we need to avoid academic fraud. We need to avoid plagiarism. This is really important. If you want any kind of respect at all in a bigger conversation, the very first, very basic thing you need to do is avoid plagiarism. Because if you can't even avoid that basic mistake, you're not going to get very far adding your voice to any of those big conversations. So how do you avoid plagiarism? Well, to begin, you need to let the reader know when you write or when you're presenting. You need to let your audience know when you are using someone else's words or ideas every time you use them. It is okay if you don't tell your reader where you found a fact that is common knowledge. Now, what's common knowledge? If you imagine telling somebody a fact, if you can imagine that person saying, "Oh, everybody knows that," then we're dealing with common knowledge. If we take a fact and we say it to somebody and they say, "Whoa, where did you hear that?" then we're not dealing with common knowledge, and you need to tell your reader where you found that fact. So if I say that King Sejong invented Hangul, people will say, well, everybody knows that. But if I say, oh, King Sejong had 7 toes on his left foot, well, people will want to know where I learned that and see the picture or the x-ray or whatever it was, whatever my proof is. So if I say that, I need a citation. Now, King Sejong doesn't have 7 toes on his left foot. I just made that up. Okay, but it's the kind of fact where you need to tell your reader where you found it. This depends a little bit on your audience. So, for example, the Ricardian theory of trade is something, if my audience is all finance experts, economists, and business majors, in your first year of business school, everybody learns the Ricardian theory of trade. So if I'm talking at an economic forum or an economics conference, or if I'm just speaking to a room full of business majors, probably I don't need a citation when I talk about the Ricardian theory. But if I'm talking to a general audience, an audience of people who aren't finance, economics, or business majors, then I do need to explain what that is, and I need to let them know where it came from. To avoid plagiarism, you can use paraphrases or you can use quotations. We'll talk a little more about this later, but basically quotations use the exact words of a writer or your source, and they use quotation marks. They put them inside quotation marks. A paraphrase summarizes another person's ideas, but not in their words. So now we don't use quotation marks, but we have to use our own words to explain that idea, to summarize it. Okay, it's not enough to take a sentence somebody else wrote and replace a few of the words. So if the original sentence is, it was clear by the end of the interview that the professor had not convinced the audience. Okay, if I change clear to obvious and end to conclusion and professor to scholar and convinced to persuade and audience to group, I have a different sentence. It was obvious by the conclusion of the interview that the scholar had not persuaded the group. But it's basically the same sentence with a few words changed. It's still plagiarism. Okay, that's not a paraphrase. A paraphrase is using your own words completely. So we're not echoing the same shape of sentence, the same sentence structure. We're really using our own words to explain it in a different way. The professor had clearly not convinced them when the interview ended. Okay, that is definitely not the same sentence we saw before. When in doubt, cite. If you're not sure whether something is common knowledge, put in a citation, because it's much better to cite something and discover you didn't really need to than to not cite something and get caught for plagiarizing. Next thing, to avoid plagiarism, you need to give your reader enough information to find the source themselves. Whatever source you had, you need to let your reader know how to find it. So anytime you're using another person's words or another person's ideas, you should let your reader know somewhere in your writing the title, the author who wrote it, the publisher who published it, and the date. Okay, that is the very minimum information that you always need, no matter which system you're using, no matter what kind of content. You always need that information so your reader can find it. Now, sometimes you'll need more information than that. Okay, so sometimes you will need the name of a periodical, like the name of the newspaper or the magazine or the academic journal that is publishing it. Sometimes you'll need something like a volume or an issue. A lot of academic journals as well as magazines have volumes, so maybe each year is a new volume. So 2015 is volume 41 and 2016 is volume 42. And then in that volume, all of the new magazines or journals they publish that year are issues. So you'll have volume 45, issue 3 will be the third time they publish that year. Okay. Sometimes you have an edition. Some books are successful enough that they publish it again and they update some things. If you are buying university textbooks, you might see this where you couldn't buy the used textbook from last year's students because the publisher made a new edition. So, well, we have to use the eighth edition, and last year's students were using the 7th edition. So you have to buy a new book. That happened to me a few times. But if there's an edition, or sometimes a very successful book will add another chapter after 10 years or 20 years. Maybe the world has changed and they need to update. But some books will have a 2nd edition or 3rd edition, and a lot of textbooks do. There are sometimes editors for some kinds of books. Place of publication is sometimes important for some of the systems of recording your source information. Sometimes you need to include the title of the chapter or the title of the article in the book when the book is a collection of articles called an anthology. And a lot of the time you will also need page numbers or the URL, the web address. Okay, in some kinds of academic work, something called a DOI is also useful. A DOI is like a number code that is permanently connected to an academic article, and including the DOI means that you can put that code into any academic database and you can find that article. That's a lot of information, but I really recommend you record this information while you are doing your research, because it's really hard to go and find again the book that you found once. I had this before. I've made this mistake when I was in university. I found a really good book. I found a lot of really useful ideas in it, and I forgot to write down the page number where I found some of those ideas. So I had to go back to the library the night before my paper, find that book again, and stay up really late reading it again to find the pages where I found those great ideas originally, so that I could include the page number in my citation. It was incredibly frustrating, and if I'd taken better notes while I was researching, I would not have needed to run to the library. Another thing to do while you're taking records is sometimes an idea, while you're taking notes from somebody else's writing, an idea comes into your head that's your own idea. And when that happens, make sure you have a system in your notes to show which ideas are yours and which ideas belong to the writer. Because another thing about plagiarism is accidental plagiarism is still plagiarism, and the consequences are the same. Okay, so this is why it's important to avoid plagiarism. Those are some of the basics of how to avoid plagiarism. Now, the information that we're keeping that we need to give our reader, that can be organized in a couple of ways. And the next video I'm going to share will examine 2 of the main ways that university level students and university level writing organizes information about the sources so that the reader can find the original ideas of a writer.